Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land. The library is a comparatively young collecting institution, but we sit on the grounds of one of the world's great ancient libraries, a rich repository of oral tradition. I pay my sincere respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us this morning. And a very good morning to you. Thank you for your patience today. I appreciate that quite a few people would have been in the waiting room. We had an obligatory technical difficulty this morning. So if I was looking flushed and pulling a face when we got the video going, I do apologise for that. But we are all calm and professional now because everything is working. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks. I'm the coordinator of scholarship here at the library, and it is such a treat to have you here with us this morning because the library is very, very good at collecting stories from people, all walks of life, all types of professions, all types of endeavour right across New South Wales. But we often forget about our own really fascinating histories. So today we're talking about Jean Arnot, who is a really fascinating librarian and of course an indefatigable fighter for pay equality. And talking about her and her story this morning is Professor Sharon Crozier-De Rosa. She is one of the library's visiting scholars, which is a growing cohort of super enthusiastic researchers surfacing some really terrific stories from our collections. Sharon is the author of several books on women's activism and emotions, and she mentors junior colleagues in the Australian Women's History Network and has indeed mentored some of her peers here at the library, which is terrific to see as we build a really fabulous and engaged community of practice of fellows and visiting scholars. If you have any questions for Sharon after today's talk, please pop those in the chat feature in Zoom. You're all professionals now. You all know how to type in your questions, and I will come back to you at the end and I'll ask those questions. But for now, let's hand over to Sharon and learn all about Jean. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And I would like to second that the community of scholars and fellows is beautiful, warm, and reciprocal kind of community. So I'm very, very happy to be a part of it. Thank you all for listening in and watching in. Before I begin, I too would like to acknowledge country. I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the absolutely stunning unceded Darawal country, and I would like to pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present. So while researching the papers of Sydney activist Ruby Ridge as part of my National Library for Australia Fellowship Memory Keepers, which began in 2020, but because of COVID lockdowns was extended, I came across what appeared to be the last trace of Ruby, this ageing feminists lobbying for a dedicated feminist archive within the National Library. Now, Rich had been campaigning and collecting for this, what she called her dream library, since the 1950s, along with her other very close friend, Bessie Rishbeth. However, this dream was never to be realized. But to the last trace that I came across was a letter dated the 20th of July, 1983, to Harrison Bryan, who was then the Director General of the NLA. However, it wasn't penned by Ruby herself, but rather by a Jean Arnot. Enclosed with the letter was another dated 1961 to then Harold White on the subject of women's papers and so on. Now, as you can see from the little snippet of my notes that I've put in here, you know, this is kind of uncovering this letter. I was ignorant of and very keen to find out who this Jean Arnot was and what she was doing writing on behalf of herself and Ruby Rich, asking once again about this dream library. And this is like a snippet of what she said. She said, "We are two old campaigners, and I am sure that many others who have been active in women's affairs feel that it is essential for the purpose of research that the existence and location of records relating to the women's movement in this country should be known and be accessible." Now, Brian replied to "Dear Jane," which, you know, in his tone implied familiarity and respect. And referring to the previous personnel of the library and previous considerations that they'd given to this issue, he explained that the decision had been made to integrate women's materials into the library's mainstream collection. And he said, "I hope I will not disappoint you too much if I say now that I believe we should not deviate from our present and historic practice with respect to women. However," he said, "you have my firm undertaking that we shall continue to devote considerable energy and initiative to developing these collections." And then he ends by telling her that she would be, he says, an ideal candidate for our oral history project. And he extends this invitation for Hazel de Burgh to interview Arnot. Now, a few boxes further along, and I should stress that Ruby Rich donated at least 110 boxes to the National Library, I come across Jean again, this time in various cuttings from newspapers, all dated 1983. The articles asserted that then 95-year-old Ruby Rich and 80-year-old Jean Arnot had been considered, they called them militant hotheads by female detractors in their day. So you can see why I was intrigued to find out who Jean Arnot was. Arnot and Rich told journalists that early feminists, themselves included, had won rights like suffrage and equal pay. And they said later feminists had this to build on. And then the journalists quoted these two elderly feminists. "The idea around today that women's liberation began in the 60s with Germaine Greer, street marches and bra burnings, so demeaning, is foolish." They echoed each other's thoughts with a frown. "We didn't call it women's liberation. We called it justice for women." This was much more than a throwaway statement. And it wasn't simply this kind of affirmation that generations were different from each other. What I think it is a potentially powerful, very powerful statement about a feminist continuum. What it did was it challenged this still very common perception that the era of women's liberation represented this second wave of feminist activism, with the first ending as far back as the 1910s, and there being relatively little in between. And I do love this image of Ruby and Jane sitting in Ruby's home in Sydney. So why is it important then to introduce Jean Arnot to those of you who are unfamiliar with her story, with this reference to the waves metaphor? Well, mainly because in Western contexts, far too many women who took on that really onerous task of fighting for gender equality in those decades between 1920s and the 1970s have been erased, and not just from mainstream sort of societal narratives of 20th century activism, but I think much more crucially in feminist storytelling that has largely overlooked the histories of women who fell between the so-called spectacular, first wave of suffrage activism and the radical second wave, the women's liberation movement. And that is, of course, women like Ruby Rich and Jean Arnot. Now, researchers and writers like Jocelyn Scott concur. She said, sometimes the youthful arrogance of so-called second wavers led them to view their mothers' feminist concerns as being only of interest to older women. As a result, she says, Ruby Rich, Muriel Hegney, Jean Arnot were unknown or relegated to history. And I should say that this is not a complete blanket out. Someone like Marilyn Lake, has written on this in between feminisms in between the waves, decades ago. But it still hasn't got a heap of currency. Newer and younger scholars like Michelle Staff, of course, are writing fabulous stuff on this now. But when thinking about why we don't know that much about Jane, except perhaps the librarians listening in, perhaps too, there is the fact that over the course of her very sort of public career, she had been quoted uttering what I would say are ambivalent or ambiguous views about women, oscillating between strident and conservative, which may well present some historians today with some feelings of discomfort. So, for example, in 1938, The Sun quoted her as saying that she would much further be dragged about by the hair, as in prehistoric times, than to work for unequal pay in industry. But if we fast forward to 1964, and we have the Canberra Times, which reported that as president of the National Council of Women of New South Wales, Jean Arnot asserted that girls in provocative clothing invited sex attacks. So you can see, again, why there's a level of discomfort in trying to kind of classify her feminism. Now, whatever the reason for her relative obscurity, confronting my ignorance and following the threads brought me here to the State Library, where not only were Arnot's papers lodged, but of course, as Rachel has said, where she worked as a pioneering female librarian for decades. And it was during her time there and her experiences there, as well as elsewhere, which spurred her to undertake the tireless job of fighting for the rights of the Australian woman worker, or just generally the woman worker. Now, for those of you who don't know of Jean, I'm going to give you a very brief synopsis of just a few aspects of what was a very varied and complex public life. Attending school in Sydney, Arnot had intended to attend university, but her father's ill health obliged her to abandon that and to instead earn a living. In 1921, she was appointed temporary junior library assistant at the Public Library of New South Wales. Later on, while she was occupying that position, shift work and very inflexible shift work conditions prevented her from completing a degree that she began in economics at the University of Sydney. And so thus she remained working in the library. Her professional career stretched nearly 50 years, most of which time she excelled in cataloguing. And just to have a brief glimpse into this, I kind of find references to this. The card catalogue was referred to as Miss Arnot's baby. As a cataloger, she was also selected to undertake like these fact-finding missions in the UK and US and so on. But now to some more egregious bumps in her career, and I'll elaborate on those in a moment. In 1946, she applied for the position of principal librarian at the Public Library of Queensland, but she wasn't interviewed for the position. Appointed head cataloger in 1950, she was unexpectedly made acting Mitchell librarian in November 1956 to cover the absence of Phyllis Mander-Jones. 2 years later, under unfavourable circumstances, she returned to her cataloguing job and she remained there until her retirement in 1968. Now, as an activist, she participated in, was a member of, and was an office bearer in so many organisations, too many to mention, but I'll give a bit of an insight. She was motivated at the very outset to become an activist because in 1937, as a female librarian, she was indignant, frustrated, hurt at the fact that she earned 47% of her male colleagues' wage. So while she had already joined the Public Service Association of New South Wales in the 1930s, in 1937, she joined the Council of Action for Equal Pay and was inspired by Muriel Hegney, which was one of the founders. She was a foundation member and office bearer of the Australian Institute of Librarians. She was the president of the National Council of Women of New South Wales, and elected an honorary president for life, I think, in the 70s. She was also president of the Business and Professional Women's Club, and she belonged to other clubs, like, for instance, I've written just like the Pan-Pacific and Southeast Asia Women's Association, to the League of Women Voters in Australia, and so on. Jean Arnot is referred to in some histories. So I said she's not really in Australian feminist histories. but in library and labour histories. And there's, of course, as many of you will know, there's a few memorial fellowships and prizes. My research into her life and legacy was prompted in 2019, when Emeritus Professor Diane Kirkby said we need to take Arnot's contributions to the development of Australian society much more seriously than we were. An image that's familiar to many of us. Just a brief note then on her archives. In 2007, Louise MacLeod noted, Arnot's papers are in wonderful order, contained within 16 neatly ordered boxes. Now, as a professional cataloguer, she arranged her papers in exactly the way that she wanted them to be seen. Now, this might hamper the research interests of some, but it doesn't do so in my case. On the contrary, I'm driven to try and to understand how she wanted her role in public life to be seen by those who came after her. Comparing this kind of form of self-composition against evidence of how others have remembered her, for example, later I will refer to David Jones's obituary of her, I think that this is a really lucrative way of accessing the emotional dimensions of society's gendered expectations, how women, for instance, should feel, but also the activist Jane's own attitudes to the emotional labour that she expended in her activism, but also her attempts at emotional management. So therefore, in my examination of her very carefully curated archives, I read against the grain. So that means just reading her papers in light of perhaps what she doesn't think she's revealing, or in light of what other records reveal about her, because I want to see what she omitted from her collection, and thereby build up a much deeper picture of the complexities of feminist identity in those sort of more obscure interwar years. Now, Jean Arnot she would not enjoy, the benefit of equal pay, right, in public service until 1963. And that is 5 years before her retirement. So having sat in the archives, accessing what insight she thought she was allowing us into her experiences and her feelings about equal pay, reading obituaries that later, tried to re-represent those feelings, and then combining these with my background in theorizing the relationship between history and activism and emotion, I felt compelled to look into this area a lot more. So that's what I want to do here for the remainder of my talk. I want to trace how Jean Arnot perceived the nature of the relationship between, on the one hand, the law, justice, the state, and on the other hand, herself as a woman worker employed by the state, all in terms of the kind of emotional dimensions of that relationship. So just briefly, I'm just going to talk a little tiny bit about the kind of scholarship that is available currently on emotions and law, because this will help me to situate Jean Arnot's, campaign for legal reform. In recent years, there has been a growing interest in emotions within legal contexts, epitomised, for example, in 2010 when Catherine Abrams and Helen Heron wrote the article, Who's Afraid of Law and the Emotions? And the kind of themes that they've looked at in this kind of growing area are like the emotions of legal actors, like judges and witnesses, as well as the legal relevance of individual emotions like hope or empathy or remorse and more. And we do have fabulous scholars here in Australia working on this, like Alicia Simmons and Katie Barkley and more. So in this way, this conceptual shift in legal studies mirrors that of other disciplines that have increasingly tried to dismantle this absolutely fake binary where you have emotions on the one hand and you have reason or rationality on the other. So they're trying to dismantle the idea that things like theatres of law or theatres of politics have one without the other. And the paradigmatic shift also extends to historical studies. So that's what I'm kind of doing here in my project on Arnot, which I am undertaking again as a very fortunate State Library visiting scholar. I centered initially on trying to uncover the emotions in the activist archive. So let me elaborate just a little bit there. In Jean's papers, I came across a 1988 edition of the Australian Library Journal. Now, in it was a letter to the editor, and it was penned by Deakin University's chief librarian, Margaret Cameron, at the time. And what she did was she took objection to the editor's recent, she said, sweeping sentiments about librarians' lack of social conscience. I can say, I'm sure that all the librarians are shaking their head in disgust. I think you are wrong, Cameron asserted. More than that, she said the editor of a journal about and for libraries should know better. However, she then wrote that the more worrying aspect of all of this was that the editor was probably voicing popular opinion, and this led her to assert that librarians needed to speak much more directly to the public to convince them of the profession's profound commitment to, and she said, arguing for services to the poor, the unemployed migrants, those with literacy problems, and other less fortunate members of our society. There was no lack of social conscience on show in Jean Arnot's papers. She acted as a memory keeper for women's memory. She collected, she organized, collated cuttings and more so that these women may yet be remembered. And I think at this point, it's also worth pointing out that one of the things that we, you know, in this working in this sphere that we need to think about is that while she and people like Ruby Rich, a prolific collector of other women's stories so that they aren't forgotten, it's only if we access Jean Arnot or Ruby Rich's archives that we then uncover these histories. So it's just a kind of conundrum, something that we need to think about how to make visible the histories of women that other women collect. But again, that's kind of like a side issue to this talk on Jean Arnot. But also she archived information about and on women's rights, especially equal pay campaigns for reform. When digging down deeper into her papers, other emotional concerns and matters of conscience, you know, they kind of rose up to the fore. So for example, she lauded the roles of wife and mother, roles that she never came to occupy. However, she also committed herself to elevating the psychological and the social value of paid employment beyond the needs of the family, i.e. careers for women. And you can kind of see this with the, you know, the center bit here. These are her scrapbooks that she organized over and time again. And this one is, you know, the Australian Career Women, Men Hold Her Back. And so not only does she collect all of these kind of articles that are about her, about people she knows, but also more kind of general social interest stories on the woman worker. She alternately pleaded for and demanded, so the tone shifts throughout her papers, for people to recognize that women deserve to feel good about their work. They deserve to feel good about their contributions to society. Her emphasis on emotional and psychological well-being has briefly been touched on recent scholarship, for instance, by a young scholar, Emma Sarian, about women's kind of rights to healthy personality, and that's what it was called, and they were in circulation at the time. So Jean is kind of tapping into circulations and shifts that are ongoing in her own time. However, the more I encountered her voice in the archive, the more I moved towards trying to comprehend what emotional expectation she had, not simply of general society, but specifically the Australian state and its legal system. I mean, she is involved for decades in the campaign to enact legislative reform. Yes, she desperately wished an end to biased and sexist attitudes, but ultimately she was seeking legislative reform that she hoped would put an end to discriminatory practices, including, and these are just a few from her own experience, again, at the beginning of her career, that she would only earn 47% of an equal male colleague, that she was ruled out of contention for the Queensland State Librarian job on account of her sex, not on account of her skills or her experience. And this was in 1946 and again in 1947. In 1958, after serving 2 years as acting Mitchell librarian, she witnessed what I would say is an incredible discriminatory manoeuvring of the library management and trustees who rolled that head library position into the workload of the serving male deputy principal librarian rather than allow a woman or rather than allow Jean Arnot to assume it in any more permanent fashion. Finding that after decades and decades of campaigning, the legislative reform that was finally enacted, and this is in 1960, ruled out equal pay for librarians. I mean, the irony is kind of, I'm laughing because it's sad irony, because her profession, librarians, was deemed a female profession and therefore not subject to male-female parity. And so you can see in that moment in her archive, that kind of, that emotional kind of mountain that she has to re-begin again to climb, she has to begin the campaign anew. So I want to look at one of these in just a little more detail to give you a bit more of an idea, right? On the 14th of May, 1946, Jean Arnot applied for the position of state librarian in Queensland. And her letter of application was accompanied by these exemplary references recommending her unequivocally for the role, and these are in her archive and can be read. On the 16th of July, so she applies for it in May, on the 16th of July, she sent a notice that she is not successful. And by the way, this is just another, example of the kind of the use of emotions in activism. And for those of you who've seen anti-suffrage postcards and so on, then you can see that there's, from humor to nostalgia and so on, that they play a very large role in activist toolkits. Now, 1 week later, so after she receives her first rejection letter for the role in Queensland, she took part in a panel entitled, "Should Both Sexes Receive Equal Pay for Equal Work?" And this is on her 90th birthday. This was reprinted and reproduced for everyone, this really amazing commemorative, like ephemera. Recorded by the ABC, the discussion was aired as part of its programme, The Nation's Forum of the Air, later that year. Now, fellow panellist Mr. C.P.T. Throsby expressed utter horror, he said, at the madman's rush that he was part of every afternoon on the Wynyard Tram platform. This made him wonder, he said, if there was anything left of chivalry. Such tram platform barbarity was enough for him, it seems, to rule out the fairest sex for having to jostle with men for position in the same way that they would jostle for jobs if equal pay was on the table. Well, at least I presume that this is what he was trying to say with this analogy. Jean responded, and I've printed it there, "We prefer justice to chivalry." Applause. I think anybody does. Indeed, as evidenced by the documents in her archive, this Sydney librarian's experiences in applying for the position of the Queensland job affirmed that not only was equality preferable, but that chivalry in the year 1946 was definitely lacking. The library position was advertised again in November 1946, and again, Jean Arnot applied for it. And these are the kind of, again, the traces of jobs, of how she kept such a kind of remarkable archive of not only her own experiences, but here you'll see these are just vacant positions, how much money they're getting, where they're advertised, the dates they're advertised, and so on. So she really is researching, the job market and putting together her own kind of personal, private history of it. Later, Jean wrote a letter to Brisbane's Courier Mail, referring to an article it had published, revealing that it had taken the state, so this is what they said, it had taken the state 12 long months to successfully appoint a head librarian after considering the applications of 14 candidates. And what the article didn't say, and what Jean later found out, was that the Queensland Library had offered the position to at least 3 male candidates before the third one eventually accepted it. Now, her letter to the press read, "A woman holding all the necessary qualifications applied for the position. To my knowledge, several men, not one of them as fully qualified as she, all from other states, were interviewed for the position, whereas no interview was granted to her. The only inference that can be drawn is that women were not considered for this position simply because of their sex, professional qualifications for the position being a secondary consideration." The following day, she received her second and final rejection notification. Now, the Courier Mail published little snippets on this issue, throughout the year from when Jean first contacted them to beyond to the second rejection. Earlier, for example, in April of 1946, it ran with the headline, and I have it here, bias on library job denied. I mean, it's not obviously like a headlining article considering it's so small, but of course it does respond to Arnot's accusations. It also published her follow-up correspondence to this. She said, if this is true, so there wasn't bias, how can Mr. Edwards explain why personal interviews were granted to at least 4 men, not one of whom was as fully qualified as I, whereas, and again, this repetition of no such interview was granted to me. To the State Public Service Commissioner's Department, which was responsible for the State Library in Brisbane, after receiving her second rejection, she wrote, I consider it would have been more correct if you had stated that my application for the position was not considered because I am a woman. I can draw no other conclusion because to my knowledge, 4 men, not one of whom was as fully qualified as I, were granted personal interviews, whereas no such interview was granted to me. Now, the chairman of the library, and I put his letter in the middle here of the slide, Mr. L.D. Edwards, then he closed off the possibility of any further exchange on the issue, writing to Jean. He says, I declined to deal with a matter of this kind, partly through the press and partly through direct communication. And he actually, of course, just declined to deal with her complaint at all, whatever the format. Now, for those of us privileged enough to spend time immersed in the archives, we know the beauty of a piece of marginalia. I find this handwritten notification on a copy of Arnot's protest letter among her records. It was dated 2 years later, so in 1949. And I think it's really poignant for the insight that it gives us to the degree to which she tried to be strategic in her efforts to be heard and her efforts just to be taken seriously. I thought maybe she was writing to herself, but I see there's a Mr. Smith written here. Perhaps somebody knows who this is. I'm not really sure. Perhaps she's writing to the future researcher. But she explains that she had chosen to write this letter in the third person purposefully. Right. So, not one of them as fully qualified as she, etc., because she said, I thought more notice might be taken than if I argued in the first person. I'll come back to that in a moment. Many decades later, in 1978, on the advice of her friends, she started to do this kind of makeshift memoir to aid her oral history interviews with Anne Robinson of the State Library. She encapsulated her unchanged views on equal pay for the sexes. The policy of equal pay for equal work is just, she said, because it is a basic plank of trade union policy, and internationally, it has been proclaimed as a basic human right. Until women are employed as workers for services rendered and goods produced with no hindrance to appointment, to promotion, and differential treatment in remuneration because of sex, so long must the struggle go on. Her essay entitled Embedded in the Soul in Jocelyn Scott's 1994 book, Taking a Stand, Women in Politics and Society. Well, in that, she said, the case for equal pay is based on the strong foundations of justice and the claim of every individual to impartial treatment. Women are the community just as well as men, and there is no reason to suppose that an injustice put upon one part for the benefit of the other is of any advantage to the whole. How does this then shed light on a budding field which now looks at the emotional dimensions of legal rights, of legislative reform? Well, here I argue that it aligns with what Emily Clip White terms the legal concept of human dignity. And what Sanjay Jain says is the growing expectation that social, political, and legal institutions are infused with and informed by public emotions, right? And that is dignity, fraternity, equanimity, empathy. Emotions, right? that underpin the social norms of human flourishing and well-being. Now, likewise, David Bulcott, he notes the moral concept of emotional dignity is often reinforced by ritual, he says, but sometimes it is enforced by the law. And what he does is he furthers this with, he says, conscience and emotional dignity are vital components of a sense of self. And importantly, awareness of self opens the door to awareness of others as others, right? And then he says that the relationship between self and others constitutes the arena for all social intercourse, including expressions of concern and respect. So it's a really important kind of concept that many more are arguing that the law should have, did or didn't, and perhaps in the future should underpin. Discriminatory laws run counter, he said, to the law's responsibility for generating the conditions for protecting the physical, moral, and emotional well-being of individuals, fostering integrity and moral connectivity. Now, we know then that Arnot was fighting just that, discriminatory practices and discriminatory laws. Arnot's correspondence with both the press and the government department over the Queensland job revealed to me that on the one hand, she kind of issued this repeated plea for her individual human and emotional dignity to be acknowledged. And this is her as an individual who's qualified to undertake the job, who should at least be interviewed, versus her as just simply representative of a sex, right? And this is through that kind of repeated utterance that I drew attention to, whereas no such, opportunity was afforded to me. But on the other hand, I think it reveals that she has a lack of faith that the appeal will be honoured. And I think we can see this through her self-effacement via adopting the third person, just in the mere hope of being heard, seen, read, taken seriously. So this oscillation between positive feeling and negative feeling, I think, traps the individual doing all that pleading and lobbying in a relentless emotional roller coaster that is both private and public, personal and political. Now, in her 1994 essay, The Embedded in the Soul, she elaborated on another aspect of her perception of the nexus between the individual, the emotions and law, namely the obligations of the state and all of this. So not simply individuals making day-by-day decisions. She argued that the state was obliged to ensure that labour legislation protected the material well-being as well as the emotional dignity of every individual, irrespective of sex. And she said it could do that by bringing in a minimum wage for all workers, male and female. Now, what she did in that essay for Scott in 1994 was she tried to encapsulate the essence of her many speeches. And I just put down this picture for you, and this is only one tiny folder. And I hope you can get a sense of how many speeches she wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote over and over again. And they're all sitting, and so many. I mean, it's quite amazing to read how repetitive some of these are, and yet they're full of passion, showing that her passion transcends time, transcends repetition. So she tries to sum up the essence, and I've put the words up here. She said, the state as employer should lead the way. It doesn't matter in the least if we believe in communism or not, she said. Soviet Russia has had the courage to try out this new experiment, and as far as one can judge it, it is working well. So here she's arguing for the law as a set of norms that regulated relationships between individuals as well as between individuals and the state. The state was obliged, she said, to ensure and protect her human dignity, tasked with the real and the moral responsibility of ensuring her physical and emotional well-being as a woman worker, or even, I shouldn't even have said woman, as a worker. Now this, what I've just gone over, is just a really brief insight into the intellectual framework that Jean Arnot developed around her reform activism. This was hard work. It was well researched. It's beautifully and intelligently articulated, and yet we know so little about her and about her contributions to Australian history. So I want to draw this talk to a close, getting there. Although there is so much you could say on Jean Arnot, on a multidimensional theme that is really important to me in my research, and that is the passage of time, intergenerational connection, communication, memories, and emotions. Given her prominence in the women's movement, as she grew older, Jean Arnot was presented with ever more opportunities for looking back on decades of activism, for assessing her generation's achievements through pronouncing her judgment on the state of gender relations here in her present. After analysing these, I think we can sum them up thus. Some of her recollections capture what the previously mentioned Sanjay Jain says are negative public emotions, those engendered by the law, like hate or anger. Others communicate an overwhelming sense of weariness and sadness. And I think it's important to note here that theorists identify the active role of the law in prompting or cultivating such feelings. So these are not just the individual feelings of Jean Arnot, but rather the feelings that the law engenders through its responsiveness or lack of responsiveness to pleas for human dignity. In 1994, for her audience, Jean Arnot recollected how mad she had felt on realising the pay gap between male and female wages when she joined the library at the age of 18. This anger, she recalled, led her to immediately join the Public Service Association. So this is a story where anger induces activism. However, if we kind of take from as a whole, her speeches from the 1970s, well, many of these kind of public addresses and reminiscences are characterized more by these kind of lethargic rather than active emotions. So, for example, in 1977, she spoke at a Business and Professional Women's Federation seminar on why she said women needed to know the legislation that affected their lives. She applauded the ongoing work of the Federation's Legislation Standing Committee. However, she couldn't help but remark, she said, "It is sad that in this year of grace of 1977, it is still necessary to have such bodies to work for the rights of women." In a 1989 address to the Newcastle West and Lake Macquarie Business and Professional Women Club, she began with these kind of positive feelings. And she told them that she'd been there before and she had happy memories of that time. And she looked on the women that she'd met then with, she said, respect, with affection. Her desire to position herself and her audience in this kind of timeline of the women's movement then prompts her to kind of adopt this historical approach. So to her younger audience there, she articulated her generation's belief, and she says that the fight for the rate for the job and not the sex, as we used to call it, equal pay for equal work, would gradually be achieved throughout Australia. And then she adds it with how wrong we were. "Although I am out of the game now," she continued, "I keep up to date with what is going on. I am indignant and furious with some of the activities of late years, and I am sorrowful about the inequalities and the difficulties which still exist. There is plenty to do by you young women of today." And then she wishes this generation every success and satisfaction. However, for me, her utterance a few years before this in 1983, that year that I started with, where so much was happening and feminists were able to reminisce and were given opportunities to do so. Well, I think that this captures the sheer extent and the impact of the emotional toll that the seemingly never-ending, relentless work of seeking legislative reform for women and a widespread change in attitudes was having on this aging activist. And I have it up there. She said, "Wearing away prejudice was like wearing down a stone." So to conclude, and I mean it this time, there were, as one would expect, much more positive emotional kind of expressions in the archive of this activist. Very brief examples. Miss Hazel Negus congratulates her on her 1946, that ABC radio broadcast, but she goes, "Do not let your earnestness override your sense of humor, especially when the male opponent is just being flippant," right? Or Phyllis Mander Jones expresses solidarity over that whole Mitchell librarian debacle. She said, "This is to congratulate you from my heart on the efficient way you carried on in what must have been a terribly difficult period. Your achievement, even in an easier time, would have been outstanding. Under the conditions, they were Herculean." There's another letter, for instance, to the Sydney Morning Herald in 1953, where Jean absolutely objects to her name appearing under the heading, "Leading Women Fear Equal Pay May Bring Unemployment." She said, "For 20 years, I've fought to have this rate for job implemented. I shall never change my opinion as to the injustice of the case, nor will I fear its consequences." And then there's just kind of a cute one, which is joyous, I think. The roof incident. She said, "One morning I went off to afternoon tea as usual. At the Mitchell Library, the staff went up into the roof of the old library. I was going up in the lift to the roof. It's lovely up there. There were a lot of people crowding into the lift. And I said, 'Well, that's funny. What are these people all doing?' And they didn't say a word. Then as soon as I arrived, everyone sang, 'For she's a good, jolly good fellow.' It was for me. They gave me a brooch because I'd worked so hard for equal pay. The time had come, the clause had been altered. We librarians were now included." So again, that just joyousness. Now, Jean's experiences with sex discrimination have been remarked on in this obituary that I mentioned before, penned by fellow librarian David J. Jones in 1995. And I'm just going to do a little tiny bit before I juxtapose to what Jean herself said. He wrote, "But happy though she was and loyal to the library, she could not ignore some of the less satisfactory aspects of the workforce of which the public library was a microcosm. She experienced disparity between male and female wages. For others, the inherent unfairness of the system and their seeming powerlessness might have led to outer resignation and inner bitterness. She spoke at public forums and on the wireless, putting the case forward in her self-assured and measured way, never strident, always well-mannered, but firm." Now, if we rest only on Jones's seemingly sympathetic biography, or even on Jean's, tireder recollections later in her life, we might end up with a distorted view of the emotions of her labors for equality and human dignity. So I'm just going to end on this one. I love this photo of her teaching cataloging, but I want to end just on this. She said to Scott, "In the course of my career at the library, I was acting Mitchell librarian for a time, and I didn't get the job of Mitchell librarian. A man did, and I was absolutely furious. I had worked terribly hard. Then all the trustees said was, what a good job I had done, but obviously it wasn't good enough for them. I went in to see Metcalf, the assistant librarian. He showed me the letter that the trustees had sent expressing their view. I threw it across the table saying, 'They don't mean a word of it. I'm taking some long service leave.' 'Oh, no, you can't,' he said. 'You must go back to cataloguing.' 'No, I'm going on leave.' I took 2 months off, going right up by the train to North Queensland. It was a lovely trip." Jean Arnot's attempts at claiming the emotional dignity that come with achieving justice was not packaged in, and I think this is what Jones had been trying to say, and it's kind of tidy, emotionally comfortable, perhaps comforting narrative. Rather, it was messy, it was tiring, it was frustrating. It was interspersed with moments of sheer joy and camaraderie, and it is all accessible no matter how neat and organized her papers are in those papers. And just to end on whether or not we think Jean Arnot's work is finished or still relevant, this, of course, was the meme going around COVID, and I think it does, with humor, point out that we still have a long way to go. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. That was terrific. And I can see people are typing in a few questions. So while those are coming through, just a quick shout out to my colleagues in public programs, Callum McLean, Lydia Tasker. Nothing in this library happens in isolation. And I have the easy part of a scholar talk. I get to turn up and sit in front of fabulous bookcases and listen to my fellows and visiting scholars talk about their research. But there are lots of people behind the scenes that actually make this all possible, from putting the advertisements up on the website to running the technology that drives these online programs. So while we all had a little bit more excitement than we might have wanted for an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning, it was all happening, and I'm grateful to the support that I have here at the library to bring you talks like Sharon's today. So to turn to some of our questions, we've got so many interesting things coming through this morning. Now, you did mention, Sharon, that she got angry and she talked to the union. So somebody's asking specifically about support that she received from a professional body or from the union movement. Are you able to comment on that?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. It's not apparent in her archive, I should say, but yes, she did, and she was Muriel Higney, who was very much a leader in that movement, was incredibly supportive, and she fed into the movement. I'm not really sure about the Librarians Association. I'm sure they were, but certainly the public service colleagues also helped. And I think you get a really strong sense when you go through her papers of camaraderie. You know, you get a strong sense, never that she's working on her own, you know, but always that she is working with, but also she is working for people. But I do know that, for instance, Diane Kirkby, for those who are interested, has written a bit on Jane, and there is a fabulous article on her library work and activism. And Diane is a fabulous scholar of labour history, so she would be the person to go to for a much more detailed, for a much better response than I can give you.
Lots of people are saying thank you. Someone is going to accuse the next person that pushes them aside aggressively on public transport of platform barbarity. So great to see that coming back into the vernacular. I'm going to use militant hotheads. I quite liked that as a little pin. You know, they give us little very neat, glossy librarian pins that sort of perhaps hide some of the things going on in the background. So that's something that I'm going to take from today. Someone is asking about the emotions of it, and just an really interesting comment about how when you were quoting Jean directly, you used the word anger, but when you were paraphrasing and when you were describing her speeches, you talked about her passion through time and her passion through repetition. And I'm just wondering what you think, as an historian of the emotions, the purpose is in achieving reform or lobbying for something that's so big that it must have felt insurmountable. I mean, it's not like she was lobbying for 98% to 100% pay difference. She wasn't even halfway there. The value of anger versus passion.
I love that that's such an easy question. Like, I mean,
that's what we're about here at the library.
Yeah, just take it easy on me on Tuesday morning. Look, I think there's been some great scholarship on this, and I know somebody like Sarah Ahmed and stuff will talk about like the feminist killjoy and things like that, where women, for instance, as activists, and I'll only speak on this because this is what I research, that rage and anger and loudness and so on, which is looked down upon by mainstream society, is actually liberating, and you know, and it allows for the voice. And by the time you get to, of course, the women's liberation movement, that kind of anger comes to the fore in a way that it wasn't allowed to before. So, for instance, you have, you know, the shrieking sisterhood, you know, as they're called, in the early 20th century about the suffragists. Oh, by the way, the Australian version at the same time was the shrieking cockatoos. So I do love that it was regionally specific. So I do think, but I think, and there's a lot of social movement theorizing that goes on, not historically, but sociology. And they talk about the emotions that keep activists together and the emotions that propel them through long periods of activism. And everyone knows that anger is exhausting. And so anger cannot be at the fore, I think, of decades long activisms, right? Others, for instance, like more simmering emotions like resentment and so on. Or those can kind of keep you, but those angry outbursts, which are exhausting, they might spur certain moments in a movement, but they couldn't keep it going. I think passion is one of those things that is, I think, overlooked. I don't know that we theorize or write enough about it, because that interest in how she does, I mean, if you actually look at her copies of her speeches, that one folder I showed you is only one of so many. Like, she is repeating herself. She must be one of the most passionate people ever, for decades, to be saying the exact same thing, only updating statistics. So I would say passion is there all the time, dedication. Ruby Rich called it responsibility. We do not leave the future, the past indebted, the future indebted to us, unless we, so on. She ties future, past, present, and hers was responsibility. Whereas when I read Jean Arnott's papers, there's anger, there's frustration, there's, a demand for dignity. There's a real sense of unfairness. And I think that's what goes in there. Yeah.
I'm going to try and squash in one more question. So this is a very difficult question, but in a different way. Someone has picked up on some of the many beautiful photographs that you shared with us this morning of the archive in all its glory of different formats, and some things neatly cut, some things torn. Was there something that was especially delightful for you when you came across it for the first time?
Oh,
yeah, it's hard in a different way. I shouldn't have asked that one.
No, that is so different. I think, okay, just two things. If I can do two, right? This is me sitting on the fence, right? One is marginalia, right? One is the handwritten notation, for instance, that I find some of the most emotional things to come across in the archive, because someone's hand has touched this, has updated it, has tried to communicate to us from the past through to their future, to tell us a little bit more, as if they're really trying to push the documents that they're leaving to communicate more to us. But one of the other things is the repetition of things. To know that I found Jean Arnott in Ruby Rich's archive, and to go to Jean Arnott's archive and find the mention of Ruby. I first met Ruby here, and then also that she has the same cuttings and, of each other and so on. And there's just this beautiful moment of, like, this synergizing moment of connection across archives, across time and space. And I think that finding connection and finding feeling in the archives. And I do feel very, very blessed to be able to just sit there, and kind of immerse in that and find those connections.
It was fabulous to host you here in the Horn Room and in Special Collections. The unflappable Sharon Crozier-De Rosa, and please join us next time. Next time we'll have Emeritus Professor and former Ross Steele Fellow, Penny Russell, and she will be talking about the art of the very extraordinary John Ray. I think he is my favourite dead white man. If you haven't come across John Ray in your reading on Sydney history, you will be absolutely thrilled by the story of Sydney's first full-time town clerk, who was an intelligent, slightly eccentric man who innovated in ways that we actually take for granted today. So I really do hope you can join me and Penny Russell on Tuesday, the 6th of August at 11 a.m. for another fabulous story from our Fellows program. Until then, thank you very much for coming, and stay safe, and I'll see you soon. Bye.